So we are a community committed to education, promotion, and advancement of psychedelic research to facilitate the development of evidence-based, legally accessible treatment for those who would benefit. And we're still, you know, it can be a work in progress. Any other thoughts people have, we'll put it on the next email that we send out. So thanks to people who helped us craft that. The other thing that came up, we talked about the role of affinity groups. And in our eagerness to get them going last time, we, with the support of the group, realized that we absolutely want these affinity groups to happen. We don't want to police them, so that we are supporting them, but we don't want to narrow what people are doing in any way, and so because that would take, we'd have to say this feels okay to us or it doesn't feel okay to us. We trust that whatever you're going to do is going to advance the cause, and so we don't want them to say, you're sponsored by BPRG. They're happening organically. That's how we want them to happen. We still want to hear from you, so we want it to be a two-way street. We just realize we don't want as much responsibility and have our names on them. So does that make sense to people who are involved? Thank you, Mike. So that's said with an open heart. It's not to close anything off. So that's a good segue to get some updates from the affinity groups. So we're going to start with people we've heard from before, or groups we've heard from. So Katie Infantine, if you can tell us about what's going on in the ketamine world, please.
Thanks, Anne. Hi, everybody. So the affinity group is being organized and led by myself, Libby, and Mark Green. So we are meeting about every 2 months, usually coincides with this meeting. And we've got about 20 folks so far. It's mostly made up of licensed therapists and psychiatrists, but we're open to anybody who's really interested in joining us. So we're really just sharing ideas about protocols, things like set and setting, music, individual therapy versus talking about using it in a group setting, and like different routes of administration and figuring out really how to do the dosing. We're working with a couple compounding pharmacies to try to figure out how we are going to get the right kinds of oral tablets for the dosing. So we're figuring that out, and yeah, and we're also forming our own groups to use ketamine ourselves to further familiarize ourselves with the process so we can be as best a support as we can to our clients. So that's all from us. If you want to email us, I think our emails are on the email that Anne sent out. So.
Right, and if you can't find them, ask me.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie. It's great work. So Yvonne, just briefly, are you, please? So as you know, the last meeting we had just such a wealth of people here from all over the world because of the symposium at the Radcliffe Institute that Yvonne organized, and he gave us a little preview. And so I just asked him for a quick update, which we know isn't the final update, but just, I was too curious to not have him give us some update.
Thank you so much, Anne. And thank you, Anne, Ron, and Dick. Yes, so when was that? At the end of January, we were lucky enough to have 20 experts from different fields related to serious illness care. So we had like psychedelic researchers and oncologists, palliative care researchers, psycho-oncologists, and spiritual care researchers. And the question behind this endeavor and this two-day seminar was how can we move responsibly psychedelic-assisted therapy research in patients with serious illness. And as you probably know, the studies, some like very important studies have been conducted in patients with cancer with psychedelic-assisted therapies at NYU, UCLA, and Johns Hopkins in the US. And these studies have really contributed to shift the landscape of the psychedelic-assisted research more globally. And that said, these studies were conducted mostly by psychiatrists and who tried to reach out to other researchers who were caring about seriously ill patients. But at that time, because of all the stigmas, they were not that successful. They had to conduct the studies by themselves. And so now it was very, very interesting to see those folks from different approach, different world, different disciplines discuss together these questions of what is, how can psychedelic research inform the care of seriously ill patients and research in seriously ill patients, and how can palliative care research or psycho-oncology research inform psychedelic therapies in seriously ill patients. So we are really in the midst of starting to analyze the data, and we have a lot of data, very interesting. These are great discussions, and our experts were very compliant, writing on post-its all of their ideas, and so we made some very nice matrices. And so what we tried to do was to map a little bit of the landscape, some, how do we name that? Some landmarks that these experts, in a kind of collective intelligence, were thinking important to map out the research going further. So that's what I'm hoping to be able to present next time. Thank you very much.
And then Dick Simon's going to give us an update on the Mass General Center for Psychedelic Studies.
So many of you have heard some things about the center, but let me sort of give a brief overview. The intention, there's a new center being set up at Mass General Hospital that is being led by Jerry Rosenbaum, who has been the head of psychiatry at Mass General Hospital for the last 19 years. The center is looking at both therapeutic uses of a lot of these substances as well as the science and biology and brain work behind it. Just a few general thoughts, and then in terms of leadership, because Jerry Rosenbaum is running it, there is a different level of availability and access and institutional support, unlike anything that's being seen at any center anywhere else in the world, where the goal has been to get somebody who's been sort of out in the wilderness doing incredibly important work, but on the margins, now brought into the mainstream. This is absolute mainstream driving it forward. Also because it's MGH, it's Harvard, there's an additional level of credibility on this entire space, even if nothing was ever learned, which is obviously not going to be the case. In terms of learning, the intent is to look at both therapeutics, how does this work, how does this help people in specific situations, as well as a tremendous amount of the neurology and biology behind it in a way that isn't being done elsewhere. So because MGH is a leader in all of the equipment and development of technologies they developed, the person running the science at the center developed fMRI technology in general. So there are a lot of things that can be looked at a cellular level that can't yet be done elsewhere. Finally, the studies range from work with MDMA for PTSD, but specifically looking at loneliness as an indication, and ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, which sounds great and all of us here believe in, but actually establishing data that will allow third-party payers to justify paying for it. So work's being done with ketamine, with MDMA, with psilocybin around. The last thing I'll just say, and then I'll... it all came about at a talk that some of the people here may have been involved in at the Broad, where Jerry Rosenbaum, showed up and heard things about the default mode network being shut down or suppressed or reduced with the use of some of these psychedelics. And Jerry had no real prior experience or tremendous knowledge about psychedelics, but he had been working on rumination, which underlies depression, it underlies anxiety, it certainly underlies OCD. And he was like, wait a second, if we've got something that can suppress this, what could the potential therapeutic value be, as well as our learning about rumination itself? And that's where it started. That's the first study. That one's funded and about to actually begin enrolling patients. And it's grown from there to what looks like it will be the preeminent, or certainly one of the preeminent research institutions on this space in the country and the world. So we're talking to some major donors. We're talking with some partners who are very interested in getting involved from an industry side. So a lot's going on, and happy to talk to people more about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Dick. I also would just like to put a plug in for Dick and what he's done. He basically has made this get off the ground. He's been a longtime friend of Jerry's and feeding him information, just data. And finally, Jerry saw the light. And also, so Jerry has retired, which I think was implicit. Right, retired from chief, and this is, am I saying it right, his main project right now.
Yeah, he's running another center, but he's putting like 80%
Yeah,
of his effort.
it's really been amazing to watch his turnaround, so thank you, Dick. Then we have two new affinity groups we're looking forward to hearing from, and we're very grateful for the work people are doing around them. So the first one is the Diversity, Outreach, and Inclusion Group, and my MAPS wonderful partner, Mike Alpert, is going to give us an update on that.
Thanks for the introduction, Ann. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Alpert. I'm a psychiatrist working with Ann on the MAPS Phase 3 clinical study. And this past week, we actually just had our first meeting of the Diversity, Inclusion, and Outreach Interest Group. It's a group very much in its infancy. There were about 8 or 10 people who showed up at my apartment. We spoke for about 2 hours, and we're in the process of still trying to define this group, which I'll say more about. Basically, we spent a good deal of the meeting talking about potential first steps and actions that we can take as a group that's focused on diversity, inclusion, and outreach. The first was ways that we can bring in diversity into the medical side of the research. So things like, how do we bring in more therapists of color into this work? How do we reach out to and bridge divides with communities of color that might be, for very good reasons, mistrustful of psychedelic research and of clinical medical research in general? So we talked about a few first steps that we can take in terms of meeting those goals. We also spoke about the idea of doing some community outreach, such as arranging for teach-ins with people, say, from the research community in local communities in order to spread awareness about the work that we're doing and its potential for widespread benefit and use. The other thing we touched on was how to address diversity issues within the BPRG itself. How do we increase the diversity of the membership? Are there any ways that we can reach out to therapists, clinicians, researchers from a diverse range of communities who would be very interested in this work and have a lot to contribute? And also, how is it that we can address diversity issues in terms of who's being invited to speak, and maybe questions that we can ask of the speakers to address when they come in to speak with this group, to place their work in a broader structural and historical context. As I said, this group is in its infancy, so one other thing we're working on is defining what the goals are for this group and how we're going to achieve them. Are we a group that is focused right now primarily on taking action steps towards addressing some of these issues that are apparent immediately that we can act on, that have been discussed in the psychedelic community for years? Or is this going to be a group that is more a reflective space for people to process their feelings and emotions regarding diversity issues and talk about this in a more theoretical context. Additionally, when we speak about diversity and inclusion, are we focused on the medical, scientific, clinical, legal research with this, or is diversity also including things that outside of the medical context that might not even be legal? So these are still some issues that we as a group are trying to define. We're trying to figure out, do we all file under one umbrella together as one group? Do we divide and conquer in order for everybody to achieve their various goals? So we're hoping in the future to create a charter for the group in order to clearly define what our goals are, and then figure out what the next steps are. So it's a really exciting time to get involved. If any of you are interested in making this work accessible, more diverse, and addressing the intersection between psychedelics and social justice, I encourage you to reach out to me, to Mackenzie, or to Georgie, and we can send you the next steps in terms of getting involved. Thank you.
Thank you. And then, certainly not least, but last, the Meditation and Contemplative Practice Group, and Dan Grossman's going to give us an update.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dan Grossman. I am a night attendant on the Boston site of the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD study, which is how I got involved here at BPRG, which I am eternally grateful for being. So after the last meeting where Robin Carhart Harris came and spoke, a friend of mine, Ann Dutton, who is the director of mindfulness education at the Yale Stress Center, where we worked together for a year, came up to me and suggested, after the announcement of the affinity groups, that we should start one that's geared towards contemplative practice in psychedelic medicine and potentials for looking at their integration in terms of research and practice. So we had our first meeting this morning. There were 5 of us total. We covered a lot of ground, and we're still definitely in the phase of kind of finding a direction and something a little more tangible to put our energy towards. But basically, many of us in this room have been either drawn to psychedelics through work in contemplative practice or drawn to contemplative practice through experiences with psychedelics. So there's a lot of common overlap in terms of the people that get involved with either of these. And to me, it's because they just share so many common insights at their core and seem to kind of point to each other in a lot of different ways. And also beyond that, even in neuroscientific research, there's a lot of shared mechanisms of action that are being looked at in terms of how psychedelics and meditation function in the brain. But I came up with a few questions that we would be interested in exploring more, so if you guys sound like you might be interested in talking about some of these things, you can definitely let me know and email me. A few of those are, how can contemplative practice inform training for psychedelic therapists, and how essential is contemplative training in terms of being able to hold space for someone undergoing a psychedelic experience. Also, how can contemplative practice assist in the integration process? To me, it can seem like contemplative practices form a sort of day-to-day function in terms of how do you actually integrate the insights you gain through those experiences into ordinary life. And then finally, how do we develop treatment protocols in psychedelic therapy that integrate contemplative wisdom in a way that honors their depth and practicality? So that's just a few of the things we covered. If you're interested in hearing more, you can reach out to me. We don't have a set date for our meeting. Probably it'll occur before the next affinity group, so let me know. Thank you.
Wow, lots happening, and I know there's more, but we don't have anyone else presenting at this point. I should say to anyone in the audience before our next meeting, if you have a project you're working on related to this, certainly feel free to reach out to us, and we might invite you to present something. So, great. So I think we're ready to move on, and I'm going to ask Ron Miss to introduce Harriet. Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and thanks to the people who gave us those updates. I'm going to introduce the first of our speakers, And as I thought about it, Anne updated us. She started the meeting with telling us about the mission statement. And it refines, I think, the definition of what the BPRG is about. But since the beginning, the name, psychedelic research, has been kind of at our core. And when I think about the psychedelic research that I'm most aware of, it involves work with MDMA and psilocybin. Those are two medicines, two molecules where work is being done in clinical research trials with the goal of having them rescheduled. And of course, pioneering work done, say, at Johns Hopkins, separate from those trials, involves psilocybin. But there's so much other research that has happened and is happening. And today we're going to get a chance to start to hear from speakers who are involved with some of these other medicines, specifically LSD and ibogaine. So the first of our speakers is Harriet DeWitt from the University of Chicago. She's in the Department of Psychiatry there, and she'll be presenting some of her work with small doses of LSD. I think the time will come in the future when we look back with a better understanding of the differences of these medicines and how physicians or therapists may prescribe one over another to work on a particular indication for a patient, how they may work in combination, or how they work at all. But at this stage, in this early exploration, I think it's exciting for us to get to hear from Harriet, who is a pioneer in studying the effects of small doses of LSD. Thanks.
Thank you, Ron, and thanks, Ron and Anne and Shippen and Georgie for hosting me. It's just been a real pleasure to meet with the people that I've met yesterday and today, and it broadens my perspective. I kind of am in an ivory tower in a little scientific world, and to hear how these drugs are being used in a more naturalistic and clinical setting is just very revealing for me. And I think we have to have an exchange going both ways. So we as scientists have to hear how the drugs are being used, and you who are using them out in the field probably should also be paying attention to what happens at the science side of things. So here we go. I am an experimental psychologist by training, and I've been doing studies with psychoactive drugs, not the MDMA psychedelic type, but other kinds of like stimulant drugs, alcohol, nicotine, all kinds of non-medical drugs for many years. And so I've developed kind of a series of procedures, basically, and then recently have been applying those to these more interesting drugs. So the question that we're looking at today is this question of microdosing, and the question is whether repeated low doses of LSD can actually do have antidepressant effects. So there are clearly widespread reports that these low doses taken every 3 or 4 days improve cognition and mood and perhaps also creativity. But these effects have not been confirmed under controlled conditions. So they're all kind of self-report, relatively anecdotal self-report, sometimes by surveys, but they're not done under controlled conditions. Now, there are reasons to be both optimistic and then also some reasons to worry a little bit about these reports. Some of the reasons to be optimistic is the volume of reports of people who do this microdosing and report that it improves their state and function. So a large number of people are reporting using the drug in this way, and they're reporting on online surveys, for example. A second point is that we know that LSD's primary mechanism of action is on the serotonin system, on the 2A receptors, and so that's the system, obviously, where antidepressant drugs also act. And there's also some evidence that LSD has anti-inflammatory and also neurogenic effects. So that's one category, so that just from a neurobiological point of view, there's reason to think that it might have these effects. We also know that high doses of LSD and psilocybin have antidepressant and anxiolytic effects, and there's a little bit of evidence from laboratory animal studies that's in support of this idea as well. So several reasons to think that there might be some truth to this microdosing idea. There are also some reasons to be skeptical. First of all, and most importantly, I think, is that the beneficial effects are deeply confounded by positive expectancies. People go into microdosing with a great deal of optimism, and they believe that it's going to benefit them in particular for their discomfort and troubles. And it's very difficult to set. We know that with psychopharmacology, with drugs, psychoactive drugs, there's a very strong influence of expectancy. So our job, my job, is to really separate the pharmacological effects from these expectancy effects. Little is known about what the optimal doses are, what the best interdose intervals are, and whether there are changes in response to the drug over repeated administrations. So these are all unknowns. Of particular concern is that the claims of the beneficial effects from the users are very variable. They're very heterogeneous. And I'll just show you in the next slide an example of some of the claims that have been made for what LSD, microdosing of LSD does. You can see the list here: increased creativity, energy, empathy, spiritual awareness, sensory effects, open-mindedness, wisdom. No drug can have all those effects. It just isn't, pharmacologically, it doesn't make sense, okay? So people are making all these claims, and the question is, what actually does it do? And that's our challenge, and it's a really hard one, I have to tell, and I can tell you before I get to the end of the study, I don't have an answer, I don't have a resolution, but I can explain to you how complicated it is to study this, basically. So this is where we stand, that there are all these self-reports. There are lots of unknowns. Does the drug affect either mood? Does it affect cognition? Does it affect perception? Are the effects of acute doses, so a single dose, is that the same as repeated doses, or does the drug effect change over repeated doses? What's the optimal dose, the dosing regimen? What about individual difference factors? Do men and women differ in their responses to this drug? Does it depend on body weight? Does it depend on what drugs you've used in the past? And then what are the brain mechanisms by which it produces these effects? And then how can we deal with the expectancies? And at the end, I've got expectancies there. It's also possible that the expectancies work in an integrated way with the pharmacological effects. So it might not be either or pharmacology or expectancy, but there might be some very sophisticated kind of integration between the two. So that's another challenge for us. How does LSD act? It activates these a particular subtype of serotonin receptors 2A. And then I've already mentioned this, that the drug might change with repeated doses. So there might be, and one of the concerns for us as we started this study of repeating doses, is that LSD is very long acting. And so there's a possibility that the effects of the drug change over repeated doses because there's an accumulation of the drug. And so then the effect, you might effectively have different plasma level, increasing plasma levels, or there might be tolerance or adaptation. There's also evidence that there's tolerance to the effects of THC. So of LSD. And these are all concerns that we had to address in designing a study. So the two pieces of evidence I'd like to just mention to you from animal studies is there is an animal model of depression that people use in rodents. They do something called an olfactory bulbectomy, and they found there was this one report at least that repeated doses of LSD normalized active avoidance learning. Active avoidance learning is a type of kind of fear response, basically, and that the drug improved performance on that behavioral task. And then in a separate study a little bit more recently, it's been demonstrated that LSD at a cellular level can actually produce neurogenesis. So it actually can enhance neuronal growth. And so that's also something that the antidepressants, that the SSRIs do. So there's another possible neural mechanism by which the drug could enhance mood or cognition or performance. There was this study done quite recently by Polito and Stevenson. This is a survey study. So they did, basically it's an online survey, and these authors tracked 98 people who were regular microdose users, and they had them complete questionnaires before they took a dose, and then during the dose, and then for 2 days after the dose. So this was a way of while the people were in their natural environments and they had access to their own drug. So these investigators don't have control over what the drug was exactly, but they could look at how the drug affects their mood and performance and how that changes over time. And this is, and the recommended doses or the reported doses that the people were using were 13 micrograms of LSD or 0.3 grams of psilocybin. That's going to be hard for me. I'm just going to talk about it. On the leftmost one is reports of feeling connected. Then the middle one is feeling happy. The last one is feeling focused. Within each graph, the leftmost point is before they take the drug. So they've been drug-free for some number of days. And then on the dose, then they have the dose day, and then dose day +1, and dose day the second day after the dose. And so you can see on all three of these scales, there was an increase in these ratings on the day that they used the drug, but that didn't last across the following 2 days. So interestingly, another thing that these same investigators did was they had people report on what they expected to feel and then what they actually felt. So here is a list of some of the descriptors that they expected to feel over on the left, and then what they actually reported on the right. So on the left, they expected an increase in creativity, sensory experiences, satisfaction with life, and you can read them yourself there. And then on the right are what they actually reported on a questionnaire. So they filled out the questionnaire as though they were going to get the drug, and then afterwards as they had gotten the drug. So you can see there are some dissociation. So they expected an increase in creativity, but then when they actually get the drug, they don't report that increase in creativity. They expected curious about new experiences, and they didn't get those. So there's a bit of a mismatch here between what they expected and what they actually reported. So, but this begins to kind of separate out a little bit what the drug, how the expectancies and the pharmacological effects. And then in this case, they are also reporting some experiences they hadn't expected to feel. So again, this is something in the clinical settings that most of you are working in. Expectancy is an integral part of the drug experience. People, you prepare people for the drug experience, and then they have it, and then they integrate it afterwards. So, so the question is, what's the role of that, and how does that change the response to the drug? A recent study also has looked at repeated dose, and this is a highly controlled study under blinded conditions, and it's an inpatient study. It was done with older people. The investigators were interested in the possible cognitive enhancing effects of microdoses of LSD, so they tested the average age was people in their 60s, and they got either 5, 10, or 20 micrograms of LSD or placebo on 6 occasions every 4 days. So this is a highly controlled pharmacological study. They didn't find that any of these doses had any real cognitive enhancing effects. So it wasn't, from that point of view, these particular doses or in this subject population, it didn't have that much effect. From my point of view, this is interesting because it provided us with data on the pharmacokinetics of the drug. So that is the plasma levels, the amount of drug that you get in the bloodstream. And so on the top left graph there is on day 1. That's the first day that they got the 10 microgram dose. So the top left is day 1 of 10 micrograms, and then the top right is day 6 of 10 micrograms. And you can see in both cases, and the time at the bottom is hours after the dose, and you can see there's a peak very early on, not surprisingly, and then the drug is metabolized and cleared pretty quickly. And what's of value to us is that there's really no difference between those two top panels, so that there's no accumulation of the drug at that 10 microgram dose. If you look at the bottom panel, that's the same idea, but for 20 micrograms. So this is day 1 on the bottom left, and then day 6 on the bottom right. And you can see here there is a little bit of accumulation. So that's something for us to be aware. This is after 6 days of getting the 20 micrograms every 3 or 4 days, I think it was. So this is a little bit of a concern. If people are taking the drug repeatedly over time, there might be some accumulation of drug, and we have to take that into account from sort of safety point of view. Okay, so move on to the studies that we've done. We've done basically 3 studies, and we're in the process of doing a 4th study. The first study, we just wanted to see what the effect of the drug single doses of the drug were on mood or behavior, or and we wanted to know what would be an optimal dose to use for repeated dosing. The second study, we looked at this what we turned out to be the optimal dose on functional on a measure of how connected different parts of the brain are on functional connectivity, and then the third one we did with LSD on EEG, and then now we're doing study with repeated doses. So the studies that we do in our laboratory are double-blind, so people don't know what they're going to get. And when I say double-blind, it's not just that you're going to get placebo or drug A. We tell them you might get placebo, a stimulant, a sedative, a psychedelic. They have no expectation of what they're going to get. And so they don't go prepared with a particular idea of what they're going to get. Usually the studies that we do are within subjects, so the same subjects get placebo and drug, so they're their own controls. We recruit healthy young men and women aged 18 to 35. We screen them very carefully to make sure they don't have any major psychiatric diagnosis, and we don't accept anyone who has substance abuse. They have to have a minimum of high school. They have to be within a certain body weight, because body weight could influence people's responses to drugs. And in our studies, they have to report having used a psychedelic drug or MDMA at least once. And there's no particular reason for that. It's not really a safety reason. It was just what I took to our ethics, to the institutional review board, that I didn't want to be the first person to administer this drug, especially under circumstances where they don't know what they're getting. So they have used at least once, and I think I probably have a side of how often our subjects have actually used. But in general, it's between, say, 2 and 20 times, something like that. And then the testing we do in a comfortable living room-like environment. So we have couches, we have videos, like nature videos, we have reading materials, puzzles, magazines, and that kind of thing. So subjects have to be in there for a long period of time. So they're just in a comfortable room with kind of ordinary light, non-fluorescent lighting. The timeline, basically, they come into the lab, we make sure they haven't used any drugs before they come in, and that the women are not pregnant, and that they've complied with all of our instructions to them. And then we administer a drug, and then at regular intervals after we've administered a drug, they stay in the lab for between 5 and 8 hours, depending on the duration of effect of the drug. And then when the drug reaches its expected time of peak effect, we give them questionnaires and tasks to complete. And we also get blood pressure and heart rate. So the acute dose response study, the first study that we did was in 20 men and women. They had to stay in the lab for 8 hours, because for that first study, we didn't know how long the drug would last, and we knew it might be quite long lasting. And so the same subjects got those 4 conditions: placebo, 6.5, 13, and 26 micrograms. They got them in mixed order on 4 separate occasions at 1-week intervals. So they came for those 4 8-hour sessions. And we measured their ratings of how they felt, how they behaved, and cardiovascular measures. Now, just to give you a picture of what the microdoses are like, over on the right panel where it says B there is the ratings of how much do they feel a drug effect, done by a study in Switzerland by Matthias Lechty, where he gave either 100 or 200 micrograms of LSD, which is, of course, that's the dose you really take to kind of have a proper perceptual experience. So you can see to the left is the doses that we gave, which was placebo, which is the lightest line at the bottom, and then orderly as 6.5, 13, and 26 micrograms. And you can see that they're just marginally effective. They're just beginning to show a little bit of a drug effect. And based on these data, we decided to use a 13 microgram dose. That would be a candidate for repeated dosing. So we want a dose of drug that doesn't interfere with people's lives, basically, but still might have a detectable effect. So the next challenge is how do we measure psychedelic drug effects? So we usually measure how much do you feel a drug, do you like the drug effect, do you feel anxious, do you feel depressed, and it could be that our questionnaires are really not designed for measuring psychedelic drug effects. And these drugs also produce unique kind of sensory and perceptual effects that wouldn't be in our rating scales. So we did include something called the 5-dimensional altered states of consciousness questionnaire that some of the other psychedelic researchers use as well. Here are some examples of questions in this. It has these 4 scales: unity, spiritual, blissful, and insightful. And these are some examples of the items that people endorse when they're under the influence. Now, just as an aside, a lot of what I do in the human lab is kind of parallel to what other people do in animal labs, so that there's kind of parallels between human and animal labs. And you can imagine when I present this to a group of people, of neuroscientists who are behavioral animal researchers, we say, well, how could we ever go about studying these kinds of phenomena and these kinds of experiences in animal studies? And in the end, it may be just a uniquely human experience, and it may not be amenable to studying with rodents or non-speaking animals. So it's just an aside and a little bit of a limitation on translational research. We like to study a phenomenon in humans and get to know it and then take it to the animal lab and see what the brain mechanisms are. And in this case, there's a real challenge there. So these are the values that we got with our 4 doses. So 0 micrograms, 6.5, 13, and 26 on that 5-dimensional altered states of consciousness questionnaire. And we got nice dose-related effects. So on each of these 4 measures, for each cluster of 4 bars is the ordered of the placebo followed by the 3 doses. And so you can see that there was a orderly dose-related increase on each of those. And so if you look at the 6.5 and the 13 micrograms, which is kind of what we were aiming for as the repeated dose, it's really just a marginal effect there. It's just on the edge of being detectable. The 26 microgram, we're starting to see a measurable effect. But so based on these data, as I said already, we chose the 13 microgram dose as the dose to go ahead for repeated studies. So then the second study we did was to see whether this very low dose has an effect on brain activity. And so there's something called functional connectivity, which really refers to how well 2 brain areas speak to each other. So this area speaking to another, and how well do they communicate. And drugs can either facilitate that kind of communication or they can block it. So we did 20 men and women. They had 5-hour sessions. They got placebo or 13 micrograms, and again, double-blind, mixed order. And we did this scanning. And basically, in this study, here they're not in the comfortable recreational room. They're in a scanner, and so basically they had no subjective effects responses to the drug at all. But we did see increases in brain connectivity between the amygdala, which is a brain region very much involved in fear and emotionality. The connectivity was increased with certain brain areas, and connectivity with the amygdala was decreased with other brain areas. And the collaborator that I did this work with, Katrin Preller, is in Switzerland, and she's done these studies with much higher doses that are expected to have antidepressant effects, and we see a very similar pattern. So this is a reason to be hopeful that this very low dose of a drug is having an effect on the brain in a manner that's consistent with an antidepressant effect. And we also found that this connectivity was correlated with people's reports of positive mood. And here's a picture for those of you who like brain imaging pictures. Basically, the red and orange refer to places where the LSD increased amygdala connectivity, and the blue and pink are areas where it decreased it. And so basically, that for those of you who understand the brain better than I do, there they are. The third study we have done are looking at the effects of EEG, again in healthy adults, to that same dose, and looking at different wave patterns. I'm not an EEG expert, but it's kind of another way to get a physiological readout of whether this drug is doing anything. And it turned out it does do something, but in this case, it just has a global decrease, and it decreases the amplitude. This is a particular kind of wave, a delta wave, and the LSD seemed to decrease the amplitude of the delta wave across all brain regions there. So it's kind of a non-specific effect. You kind of, ideally, you want there to be a change in one region and not in another region. This is basically what we found from this study. Okay. As it turned out, though, another direction we can take this research is to look at individual differences. So how do people differ in their responses to the LSD? And so one of the things that we give our subjects personality questionnaires, and we use something called the multiphasic personality questionnaire, and it has one scale called absorption. This absorption scale measures things like responsiveness to evocative sights and sounds, readily captured by entrancing stimuli, tends to think in images, experience vivid images, has cross-modal experiences. So personality questionnaires are something that people complete, and it's thought that the personality trait stays with you basically for life, and people differ on a lot of different dimensions, and this is one dimension. So if you in the audience would respond yes to all these, then you probably would score high on this trait, personality trait of absorption. So in the EEG study, we actually looked at the delta wave change in relation to absorption scores, and we did find a correlation. So on the y-axis, so on the vertical axis, you have their absorption scores, so higher scores at the top, lower scores at the bottom, and then on the x-axis, on the horizontal line, we have the change in delta power with the EEG, and so it turned, and the drug, as I told you, decreased the delta power, and it did so in the most pronounced way in the people who are high on absorption. So people who were high on absorption, personality trait had demonstrated a greater effect on this EEG measure. Okay, now to the most interesting from my point of view, this is kind of what we've been trying to get to all this time, is microdosing is a repeated dosing kind of idea. So we're doing this study now. We're recruiting adults who have used a psychedelic drug, same reason as before, but in this case also who report some negative mood, some negative affect. And so the idea here was that what we're looking at is a change and improvement over time. And so it's nice to have a little bit of depressed state to begin with to be able to detect an effect. So they receive a dose of the 13 microgram dose or placebo every 3 or 4 days for 2 weeks. So they're randomly assigned to either the LSD group or the placebo group. And they come in for 4 5-hour in-lab sessions, but every 3 or 4 days. And so on each of those, they get either the drug or the placebo. And the outcome measures are, so 2 general categories. One is we look at how the drug affects them on each of those 4 occasions. And then we also measure their mood symptoms before they participate in the study, and then after the 2 days after they complete the last of the 4 days. Does that make sense to you? So you've got randomly assigned to 2 groups. You either get placebo or drug. First of all, it turns out if you go through all the screening with people and then you put them in a room alone for 5 hours, on 4 occasions, they start reporting things. So whether you give them drug or not. So the message I'm going to give you here is that we're setting ourselves a very difficult challenge. We've got a marginal drug effect. So we want a drug effect that's kind of sub-threshold. We don't want it to interfere with their lives. So it's close to placebo. And then in addition, people who are getting placebo are kind of set to respond that they're getting something. Why would these investigators go to all this trouble of screening me and doing all this and then bringing me in all these sessions and getting blood levels of this and that and the other and not giving it? So our goal of differentiating the drug and the placebo turns out to be very challenging. And here are the first, I think we have now something like 10 of each. So 10 completed placebo and 10 placebo completed with the LSD repeated dosing. what I've plotted here is the 4 sessions. So session 1 is in the top left, and then to the right there is session 2, 3, and 4. The blue line is when the subjects who got drug, and the orange yellow one is the subjects who got placebo. And you can see we accomplished one of our goals here, and that is to give a drug that just has a marginal effect, or that is not going to interfere with their normal daily activities. On the other hand, with data like these, you don't know what you've got. You don't know whether you're too low, that you're seeing nothing at all. And for the first while, I agonized that we got the drug bottles mixed up. That was But it's the nature of studying microdosing. It's the ultimate challenge, is that we're expecting to see some long-term change at a dose that has very little effect. So then you can ask, well, was there a change over long term? What we did was during the recruitment and then afterwards as well, we had them complete a psychiatric symptom checklist. It's called the Depression and Anxiety Scale. I'm sorry, it's actually called Depression, Anxiety, and Stress Scale. So it has these 3 scales. And so, as I said, we tried to recruit people who had some negative affect to begin with, and that was based on this questionnaire. So we gave this questionnaire before and then also after their participation. So this is going to be a little bit hard for you to follow because it's a kind of a preliminary. It's actually, we've got 18 placebos and 14 LSD subjects in here. But I'm going to take you through it from the left to the right. If you start on the leftmost section, this is people's mean scores on the depression scale of that questionnaire, basically. The 0 refers to before they participated in the study. The 1 is also before they, so 1 happens during screening, and then the 0 happens when we're recruiting them. They had completed again before they start with their doses, and then the 5th session there is after they've had their 4 doses, and it's the day after, basically. So one thing the open bars here correspond to the placebo sessions, and the LSD ones are the filled sessions. So if you just look at the 3 sets of bars to the left, the first thing to notice is that even on the placebo group, their scores on this depression anxiety scale go way down over the course of the 3-week period, basically. So that's another thing that we're up against, that depression and anxiety symptoms tend to resolve with time on their own without any drug. So that makes it really hard then to detect a drug effect. If under the placebo conditions, just with time, you're starting to see an improvement in mood, then how do you detect a change that's attributable to the drug? Now, in the second subscale, you can see there's a suggestion of an effect. Now, this is early on, and this is the kind of thing that happens, and then this effect could disappear completely. But if you look at the day 5 under the anxiety scale, you can see that the LSD people are reporting a decrease in their anxiety scores, whereas the placebo people are basically staying the same. So a little bit of a suggestion that it might be improving anxiety. And then on the stress rating scale, again, no effect of the drug. So then it brings you back to the question of why do people microdose? And what is it that they're trying to treat? And then how can you measure that? So people are microdosing for a lot of different reasons. And so for us to do a study and to group them into those that are high or low on that measure makes it almost impossible, because there's so many, some people are doing it for grief, some of them are doing it for anxiety, some of them are work anxiety, some of them are just every possible reason, which it makes it really, really a difficult thing to study. So, this is the one finding that I was a little bit optimistic about, and it's basically a replotting of the data that you saw in the previous slide, and it shows you got pre and post the scores before and after their 4 sessions. On the left is the placebo group, and on the right is the LSD group, and so you can see this very subtle decrease in anxiety. So, what can we learn from this? Well, first of all, we can learn that low doses of LSD are safe and well tolerated. So before we did this study, we didn't know that. We didn't know what dose would be good to use, whether it would change with time, whether it was different in men and women, whether it depended on body weight. All kinds of things were unknowns because it hasn't really been studied under controlled conditions. We got that far. With the fMRI, we did find that the drug had some effects on brain function, even though it wasn't really changing people's self-report of that they weren't feeling any psychological effects. And we also, by the way, had tasks in there that people usually use for emotional responses. So they had to look at emotional faces and see whether they detected emotions differently, or at IAPS pictures, which are emotional pictures. So we had several tasks in there. Basically, the drug didn't affect any of those. I showed you data from EEG, and then I also showed you the data from repeated doses saying that we aren't seeing very many drug effects. Our next step is probably to increase the dose, just to be able to show that there's something going on. But then if you increase the dose, you run into all kinds of problems that people they'll have disturbing or disruptive effects that they wouldn't be able to go to work, basically, or they have perceptual issues. And so that's one direction we could go in. Another direction we could go in is select different people. So try and find people who are really distressed. And so it's just hard to know what exactly to do next. We've decided basically to go with higher dose as a first step. I said substantial placebo responding, more than we see with our other studies, and there might be subtle lasting effects. What are many questions remain, as you all know. Does LSD have antidepressant effects? We don't know that yet. What are the doses, interdosing intervals, how long? So it could be that maybe our 4 sessions or 2 weeks isn't long enough. Maybe you have to take it for 3 months. But can I invest in a study of doing it for 3 months and then seeing that there's nothing there? It's a challenge as a researcher, essentially. Then does the LSD affect other mental processes? There have been claims about creativity, which is a very difficult construct to measure, to kind of really have an operational definition. Cognition, we do look at right now, and we're not with just standardized tasks, and we don't see any change at these doses. Then golden question is how do the effects interact with context and expectancy? So it could be that the drug only has beneficial effects under very special circumstances, combining with the expectancies. And then you can ask more neurobiologically based questions. So that's basically what I have to say. These are the people that I've worked with. MAPS has been helpful to us mainly with studies with MDMA, and there's some possibility that the Beckley Foundation might support some of the LSD studies, but these are all the people that have contributed to the work along the way. So thank you for your interest. Yeah.
One of the ways that I'd imagine you could find a statistically significant effect would be to increase the power in numbers, basically, so just to recruit more subjects.
Yes.
Have you done the math on that? How many folks would you need to recruit if you were to draw those effects out?
It's a great question, and when we first designed the study, we had no idea what the magnitude of the effect was, so we didn't know how to power it. If we have something like this with the anxiety, reduction in anxiety, then that will give us a little bit of a lead, and we might be able to calculate that. The other reason I think running more subjects is a really good idea. The other reason is then we could look at variability just within the LSD group and see who is responding in what ways, and then what are the sources of variability. So it's a really good question, but if you don't know the effect size, so if you were doing the power analysis on the acute effects of the drug during the sessions, we don't have anything to work with. But yeah, more subjects would be a great idea. Yeah. Yes.
Well, I mean, maybe you said this already, but how many microdoses were there in your studies? And second of all, did you do like follow-up questionnaires like a month later, 2 months?
Right. The people came in. They got 4 occasions of 13 micrograms. So they came in every 3 or 4 days, and each of those sessions they got 13 micrograms. Does that make sense? So it's over a 2-week period. As far as follow-up, we had them come in 3 days later, and had them complete questionnaires and tasks to see if there was an effect kind of immediately after that block of 4 sessions. We didn't follow them up months later, but these are healthy volunteers, so they're not patients, they're not troubled. So, and we had such marginal drug effects, we weren't really too worried about there being lasting adverse effects, basically. Does that answer your question?
Well, I guess my question mostly comes from, you know, in Silicon Valley, it's kind of trendy.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons is because of maybe the growth of brain cells.
It could be.
In a longer term.
It could be. It could be. It's a fascinating idea. If it actually is improving hippocampal neuronal growth, that would be just amazing. Yeah.
Have you looked at all around addiction issues? It's probably too short a period of time, but you know, whether it becomes addictive.
Whether it becomes addictive. It seems unlikely. I haven't thought of it. It seems unlikely since we're seeing so little of an effect. Now, if we started seeing beneficial effects, it's kind of more like asking whether people become addicted to SSRIs. You know, it's a very slow onset effect. It doesn't have a clear subjective response. And with the SSRIs, you could say, well, yeah, they have unpleasant effects when they stop taking it. But are they addicted? It's hard. Depends on how you define addicted. Yeah.
You talked a lot about your population that you drew from, but could you highlight the demographics of the individuals more than men and women that you're recruiting into your studies, and also
sure.
how you're going about making sure that the participants are diverse and have different backgrounds? We advertise on Craigslist and around our campus and Facebook. We end up with mainly people in their early 20s. Most of them have a college degree. Most of them have used some drugs. As I said, a defining characteristic is they have to have used a psychedelic drug or MDMA at least once, and then a lot of them have used cannabis and other drugs. So I would say social drug users, but highly functional in general. Then, yeah, go ahead. Maybe more specific, like what are the racial and ethnic diversity of the participants?
You know, it's a real challenge for us. We do have difficulty attracting minority populations into our studies, and I've had some experiences where I've spoken to groups to interest them in participating in our research, and it's a broader than just our research. It's medical research in general. They say, I'm not going to be your guinea pig, or they say, I'm only going to take things that are natural, or you know, there's a lot of beliefs that work against, I mean, we do most of our work is NIH funded, and so we're under a lot of pressure to include minorities, and it's been a challenge. I would say we have maybe 8% African American, maybe another 8% Asian, but that's not really a minority, I guess. So we don't have a lot of success. Yeah.
Well, thank you for showing up, so grateful for that.
Yeah.
Question is similar to what was asked earlier on addiction, but have you studied the effects of this maybe around smoking and alcoholism? Have you looked at any of that? And this is during using microdosing, so have you seen them benefit from using microdosing?
You know, we haven't asked that question. These are highly functioning. Most of them, they can't be dependent on a drug in order to participate. I don't think any of them are cigarette smokers. Cigarette smokers are hard to find, so they're not coming to us with problems, and or certainly not problems that they're trying to solve. They're coming to us for the money, basically, and for the fun of, you know, just being in a study, if it can be considered to be fun anyway. Yes.
So you mentioned a bit about some of the effects on resting state and connectivity under the microdose. Do these effects kind of mimic higher doses? Like, is it similar? Does it trend towards like a similar kind of mechanism?
Yes, in part. So at the higher doses, you see something similar with the amygdala. at higher doses you see a change in connectivity with the thalamus, and we didn't see that at this dose. We're now actually running more set to increasing the N because you need a larger N for power. So we're continuing with that. Yes?
I apologize for already addressed this.
Fine.
But is there a reason why the 3 to 4 day interval was chosen as opposed to maybe like a daily or every other day use? Or do you have any studies with daily use microdosing?
Most of the reports I've seen of people who use it kind of in the wild are every 3 or 4 days.
Okay.
So that was kind of based on that. And if you used it every day, then you'd really, I think, run the risk of accumulating drug over time because it has such a long duration of effect. Yeah. Yeah. Either.
I know you were studying psilocybin, but I'm wondering if from the literature on psilocybin you have a sense of what differences there might be between LSD and psilocybin and microdosing?
I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know anyone that's doing microdosing with psilocybin. I presume that the Hopkins lab will begin to do that now. I don't know if, I can't think of any predictions that I would make. The only thing is that the LSD is so much longer acting that with psilocybin you might have to either take it more often or you'd have peaks. The time course would be quite different. So you might need to take it every day or every 2 days instead of every 4 days, something like that. Yeah. Yes?
I'm just curious if subjects who got LSD and not placebo reported that they liked it. Did they speak to whether it seemed beneficial in a global way?
Well, in this repeated dosing study, they reported feeling it just wasn't different from placebo. So there's nothing to report then. Now we could, once we have enough subjects, then maybe we could see whether among all the people who got the LSD, who felt it, who liked it, and you know why, and that kind of thing. Anecdotally, so I like to talk to the people after they've been in the study, and early on when we did the higher dose, the reports with the 26 micrograms were kind of interesting. They were like, yeah, things were more vivid. So there was a lot of reporting of sensory experiences, or they saw the trees more clearly, and one person was reading the menu, and he said, "Do you smell chili?" He's reading the menu. So, you know, sensory abnormalities. Now that would be a problem if you were at work. So, you know, it's interesting from our point of view. Phenomenologically, it's interesting to see what's happening, but it probably wouldn't work if you had to function during your normal day. Yeah. Yes.
So, based on what you found so far,
yeah,
could a reasonable conclusion be that almost all of the effect that's reported, like in Silicon Valley, is placebo, which you're showing an effect based on, and that you're not yet finding anything that really differentiates from placebo? And it could be recurring, it can be being used a lot in Silicon Valley and elsewhere because placebo effect can do a lot of good. But is there any evidence that the LSD itself at these doses is doing any good at this stage?
If the question is there any evidence, then no. But it's also possible that we're getting larger than normal placebo effects because of the setting that we're in. So it's kind of a bind that we're in because we can't let them go from the point of view of the IRB. So, but if you took it in your normal daily environment, then you might experience beneficial effects. So it's almost unanswerable with an ethics board. But so far we haven't seen any benefits yet. Yeah, Chip.
Thank you for your talk. I was interested about your funding, NIH. Is anybody at NIH pushing you or pushing your colleagues to expand your investigations into these fields?
Thank you for the question. The question was whether the NIH is interested in funding this, and I have to say no. I've approached 3 of the institutes. One was the Mental Health Institute, and you'd think they would be interested. It's a drug that's being used as an antidepressant. It has a mechanism that's very similar to SSRIs, and they said no. And then I went to NIDA, and they said no, and partly because, is this being recorded? I need to be careful. Because it's not really considered to be a drug of abuse.
and I'm not looking at it, I'm looking at it more for its therapeutic potential, basically. The one institute that showed some interest was the Alternative Medicine Institute, but for various reasons, I didn't get funded through that. So I've had to find funding from other sources, basically.
So you were not receiving government funding?
No, none, right, yeah. Yeah. Yes?
Did any of the participants speak to the microdosing versus their own full dose experiences, personal experiences?
I talked to a few people informally, and they said it was quite different. Yeah, the full dose of 100 micrograms is a really different experience. But I'm kind of interested in these kind of marginal effects. What does it begin to do when you start to see threshold effects? Now, it could be that something completely different happens when you have the high dose. But if you can start to see changes in psychological function or cognition or something at the very low doses, then it could give you a clue. But they say it's quite different. Yeah. One more question. Yes?
Is there a lot of pushback because of like the Schedule 1 controlled substance? I know finding it in the streets can be pretty hard, but like studying it with it, like I don't know, I feel like it's still pretty, like if you get caught with it, it's still pretty devastating. So do you find a lot of pushback with trying to research it while the federal government's still?
Right, right. It's an important question, and it certainly affects people using it in a non-laboratory setting, and it has really kind of devastating effects that they don't get pure drug, they don't know how much they're getting. It could be there could be other compounds in there as well. From my own experience, I've been doing research with scheduled drugs for a very long time, so I already had credibility with my university and with the FDA and with the DEA. And so, but the process of getting the Schedule 1 license for LSD did still take between 2 and 3 years. So and you have to be really patient and work with a lot of administrative. It takes a lot of work. So, but once you get it, then you have it, and you can basically then you can do what you want within limits. So yeah. All right. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. So, thank you, Harriet, on so many levels, and that last answer makes me say thank you even more. I think we all just so appreciate how hard it is to do this research and how important it is, so thank you for being a pioneer in this work. So now, I have the pleasure of introducing another group who are doing very different work, and we're very excited to have them here. When I asked Jonathan how to introduce him, he said, why don't you tell the story of how we met, which is really an example of how this community works. So before the last BPRG meeting in January, the night before we were having dinner, I was having dinner with Robin Carhart-Harris, and we were getting caught up, and he said, it was Saturday night, he said, I met this really interesting, lovely Navy SEAL in Oxford yesterday. I said, okay. And he said, and he lives around here. He might be able to come tomorrow. Here's his contact info. Why don't you invite him? Fine. So I got home from dinner. It was late, and I instantly emailed Jonathan, and he said, well, actually, I live in Connecticut, which feels close when you're in Oxford, England, but I can't come. But I am coming to Boston for business on Tuesday. Would you like to get together? Of course, I said. So Jonathan arrived on our doorstep about 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, and we fell in love, basically. And I will let him tell more than that, but he has started an amazing foundation. He was a Navy SEAL, and he can tell you his story. I think once a Navy SEAL, always a Navy SEAL. And he has a foundation called the SEAL Future Foundation, which helps Navy SEALs reintegrate back into our society, and he'll be much more articulate and specific than I can be. And they are using ibogaine and 5-MeO DMT as part of what they're doing, and that's why we wanted to bring him here. At the time that we were meeting, our other speaker for today had canceled, so I said, meant to be, we have an opening. So Jonathan has agreed to come. He's brought his friend and fellow Navy SEAL Eric Smith, who has a beautiful story to tell us. And Jonathan's come from Connecticut and Eric from California, so we're very grateful to them. So I'll let Jonathan take over from here.
Well, let me start with, can everybody hear me? Perfect. Let me start with gratitude to you both. A little bit more to that story. So showed up 9:30. I spent the night at their house that night. And for those that know them, that's probably not uncommon. But for somebody that didn't, it says everything I need to know about you both, and I'm so grateful for that. So, and then there's a great quote. A lot of people thank us for our service, hear it all the time. But let me stop and thank you for your service, because without a doubt, this is probably the most important thing that we've come across that is helping us. So thank you for being teammates to us, for serving alongside of us. So thank you. I grew up Catholic, and I see this basket and this. I'll send this around afterwards for collections for our nonprofit. So it probably makes sense for me to start with who I am. So if it's all right with you, I'll start there. I'll go into the nonprofit, how we came into this space, and then I'm going to turn it over for this unbelievable story from one of my best friends, and I'll give his intro after that. So who am I? Jonathan Wilson. I served 16 years in the Navy, most of that in the Navy SEALs. I live in Weston, Connecticut. We have a farm. We have a pig. We have 50 chickens, horses. We had 5 baby goats the other day. Fun fact, there's a 1 in 10,000 chance that goats have a 1 in 5 babies and they survive. That happens, which is a blessing and a curse because I'm bottle feeding between business call meetings. I also have 5 kids, an unbelievable wife, and she just had her first experience earlier this week in Costa Rica. And for those that have experienced this, you know what that means. On top of being a Navy SEAL, and actually during that transition, during that first 10 years of service, my priorities started shifting as I started having babies. As I started recognizing that maybe what was so important to me before isn't as important as being there for Christmas or raising my son and daughters or being there for their birthdays. Not to take away what we did was amazing. But once again, as I got older, I started wanting to be there more. So I decided to get out. And the hardest thing I've ever done in my life wasn't witnessing what we saw on the battlefield. It wasn't burying my friends. It was that transition. It brought me to my knees. It made me think things that I never thought. It made me think about taking my own life. And there was no resources, no friends out there to help. I didn't know where to turn. For the first time in my life, I didn't have a brotherhood, a camaraderie, a team, and I was doing something complex that I didn't know how to do by myself. I ended up going to Goldman Sachs and trading. Culturally, it wasn't a great fit for me. Nothing against Goldman. But we serve. We're here to serve. That's what we did. We need that purpose. We need that family, that tribe. So I ended up coming back into the service. Imagine me telling my wife and 5 kids, I don't know how to do this. I'm going back to service. But we started this nonprofit, and it's called the SEAL Future Foundation. And initially, it was just to help with scholarships, to offset some of those costs. And this thing has morphed, and it has helped over 700 SEALs. It has 100% saved people's lives. We started off, once again, with scholarships. We have executive coaches. We've sent probably 20 or so SEALs to the executive programs at Harvard and helped a lot of these men and their families get accepted into actual Harvard proper with some friends and colleagues that are here today, and I'll mention them here in a second. So we do executive coaching We do job placements. We build communities around the country. We call them FOBs, forward operating bases, and our Boston FOB is here with our leadership, Jen Tutak and Jean Mack. Jen has helped so many SEALs get into these Ivy League schools, and Jean was a SEAL as well. He's actually at MIT right now in the MBA program. And then on June 9th, 2017, we were feeling really good about all this great work we were doing. And on FaceTime, a well-respected SEAL with 3 kids, FaceTiming his wife, took his life. And we realized how far off we were. On the outside, we looked great. On the outside, I looked great. Oxford, Harvard, 5 kids, Weston, Connecticut, Goldman Sachs. We are suffering. It's not just us, it's all of us. We have it, and we're incapable of sharing that. So we decided to focus on this wellness space and create a safe place for us to tell each other what's actually going on, to explore modalities to treat these symptoms. And at first it was what's out there, SSRIs, and I started witnessing my friends, myself included, go down these dark holes and start thinking those thoughts again. That's not the solution. Why don't we take an inside-out approach and start looking at what's going on with our biomarkers? So we started endocrine therapy. Started looking at biomarkers. What's off? Let's give holistic supplements. Magnetic stimulations. Let's explore that. We're not the subject matter expert. Let's find out who's out there doing this. And it was working, but it wasn't really working. And then we saw a friend of ours. He was a well-respected SEAL, but he got kicked out for alcoholism. So imagine that. He's on the most elite team, on the biggest mission that we all know. And when I last saw him, he was living in his mom's trailer at 5'7", 250 pounds, because all he did was drink. You rewind to a year and a half ago, and I run into somebody, and I had no idea who it was. And it was him. And he was in the best shape of his life, and he was talking about love, about empathy. And I was just scared shitless. Like, who are you? And he started telling me about these different treatment modalities, and that he met a provider. And I was already struggling myself. Despite having a nonprofit that helps Navy SEALs transition, I was struggling. Despite having all these things, I couldn't figure it out. So after a few months, I took a leap of faith, and I went down there to Mexico and partnered with an organization called the Mission Within, and I was treated. And I promise this version that you see here is not the version that I was a year and a half ago. This version that you see here, I realize the magic that this is, the joy that it creates, the love, what we're supposed to be doing here. I would never say that out loud before a year and a half ago. I would never talk about love in the open. And that set us down a path, and collectively as a community, we've supported over 200 Special Forces treatments, and we've promise you have saved a lot of lives, marriages, and that ripple effect will continue for so long. So I'm super grateful for the plant medicine bringing us together, and as mentioned by Ann, we also, with that provider, they also treat with MDMA, psilocybin, microdosing psilocybin. I microdose psilocybin, so we can talk offline. But just once again, so grateful to come down this beautiful space that you all are aware of and researching. And once again, thank you for your service in that regards. So without further ado, what I think would make sense is for me to bring up a good friend of mine, and I'll give a quick bio, and then I'm just going to let him tell his story. And I would just say, stand by. So Eric and I met 16 years ago in SEAL training. We were in the same BUDS class, so Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training, and we were one of the 16, and there's a lot of luck involved with this, stupidity and luck, to actually get through that training. So a couple hundred people tried out, somehow we managed to sneak through. And I remember in our training, we were roughly the same height, and how the SEAL teams work when you're going through training, you have boats that you run around with if you haven't seen the videos, and they're 300-pound boats, and there's 6 people in your boat, and you're running around pulling this thing on your head, but it's all about height. So we were in the same boat crew, and he was a machine. He's from Massachusetts. He grew up, his brothers, probably his size, maybe a little bit bigger. They were known in the community, the Smith brothers. Everybody knew the Smith brothers, especially at all the bars. Avoid the Smith brothers. But in the training, he was a leader. He would drive us, and we won every race because of this man. He was exactly what he needed to be. When we went to war, he was exactly what he needed to be. There was no love, there was no empathy. We had armor on. The issue is that after that, we still had that armor on. Eric lives in Poway, California. He has a beautiful home. He has 3 beautiful boys, and Melissa, a beautiful wife. And when he got out, I thought everything was great. We had conversations about the nonprofit. I would just let him know what we're doing. You know, we have scholarships if you want to go back to school, endocrine therapy now as we've evolved. And then about a year and a half ago, he reached out and asked about this endocrine therapy. So we started helping him. And I can't remember the exact date, but I know exactly where I was at when I got the call. I was at the Prudential Center having a business meeting, and I got a call from one of our partners saying, hey, I need to talk to you. So I immediately left because she works in the endocrine space, and I knew it was one of the SEALs. She said, Eric's not doing well. He kind of disclosed to me that he's suffering, and I took a step back. It actually took the breath out of me. I was like, Eric? He's a leader. He's not Eric. Eric Smith? No way. And she told me he had thoughts, some of these dark thoughts, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to help. Then we didn't have access to this medicine, so we started focusing on Eric, came across this medicine, and were able to give him treatment. And 6 months ago, roughly, and I'll let him give the details, he went through this. And I've seen the most miraculous transformation out of all the hundreds of soldiers. Although it's very similar, his has just been so profound. And what you're going to see today is just a man full of love and happiness and joy, and we're so blessed. So please help me in welcoming my good friend, our friend, Eric Smith.
Thank you, Johnny. Hi, everyone. My name is Eric Smith. I go by Moose. I always have. I'm extremely honored to be here today. Thank you for having me. Today I get to share my story. Thank you, Anne, for inviting me. And thank you, Jonathan, for bringing me here. I had no idea how much pain that I was carrying around. You don't know until it's lifted. You don't know. It was as if I had a wetsuit on my entire life. It weighed 500 pounds. And this past October, it came right off. It came off. I went to Mexico and I took 2 medicines, Ibogaine and 5-MeO-DMT. Not at the same time. One on Friday, one on Sunday. But my gosh, it changed my life. It completely changed my life. My story begins 35 years ago. In order for you all to appreciate this healing, you have to understand a little bit about the pain and where that pain began. My childhood was difficult. It was uncomfortable. I was made fun of. I was criticized constantly. I never felt like I was enough. I grew up with so much anger, so much hate and shame and insecurity. By the time I was 17, I had enough. I left home. My transition into manhood was very challenging. I spent the second half of my senior year in high school trying to find places to sleep at night. I didn't like who I was. When I was 18 years old, I joined the Navy. I thought maybe I can become something different entirely. I can escape where I am. I can escape who I am. I didn't like who I was. I spent 10 years in the SEAL teams. And by the time I was in my late 20s, I couldn't handle it anymore. I couldn't do that job anymore. I'd had enough. Physically, mentally, emotionally. Physically, I had ruptured my pec. This muscle came right off, tore it off. I mean, not completely off, but it tore, and I could no longer lift heavy weight. That was a staple of my identity. I damaged my hip in an accident. Couldn't run fast anymore without pain. I walked with a limp, and I was ashamed of it. I was completely ashamed of myself. I didn't like who I was before, and now I'm starting to hate myself. And I knew as I'm becoming more depressed and more anxious and afraid of the entire world, I knew that things that I had experienced in combat had really affected me, really terrified me, shook me to my core. But I didn't want to admit that to anyone. I didn't want to share that. I have this ego I have to maintain. I have to protect all this stuff. But it was too much. It was like a mountain, and it started to come down. I never had the foundation set to support it. It wasn't ready for all that. I wanted out. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to die so bad. I thought about it all the time. I just wanted to kill this precious thing. I wanted to kill it. I left the Navy with my head down, completely ashamed of myself. Doctors tried to help me. They did the best that they possibly could with the tools that they have available. One day, out of the blue, a friend called me. This wasn't long ago. This is only this past September. A friend called me and he said, "Hey, Moose, I'm going down to Mexico. I'm going to take some psychedelics. It's a retreat, and there's an open spot if you'd like to come." I thought about it for just a few seconds. I said, "Yeah, I'm in." Because what do I have to lose? I have everything to gain. My life, it was like sliding across sandpaper. It was not easy. I'm watching the world go by from the bottom of a fucking hole. That's depression. That is what depression is. It's terrible. And I feel so much sympathy for anyone who is going through that because it is awful. 3 weeks later, I'm in Mexico. I'm in this beautiful house. It's a Friday night. It's a beautiful night. And I just swallowed these 2 gigantic capsules of ibogaine. This root medicine, this plant that I had never heard of. Just weeks before, I had heard of the stuff, and now it's inside me. And I'm nervous, and I start to feel kind of panicky. And shortly after we took the medicine, I'm laying down on a mattress, and I've got this silk eye mask on my face, and there's beautiful music playing in the room. And that panic, that nervousness, that tension, it's building up. And mixing with the onset of this medicine, it was terrifying, and it started off very, very scary. Bees, I could hear them. Millions of bees trying to get into this house. They're gonna swallow me up. I could hear machine gun fire outside. I'm like, oh, this is all going bad. And now I'm like cemented to this mattress. I couldn't move. And then, to make it worse, my bed, it starts to move. And it starts to really move, and it's flying through the room, and I'm hanging on like, what is happening? And then something deep inside of me, like in the bottom of my stomach, just popped open. It was as if these capsules had burst, and the medicine just poured out and started coursing through my entire body. It was like ropes of laser just coursing through me. It was coming for me. It was taking over me. And it's coming up my spine. And in desperation, I just said, "I trust you." And I let go. And everything became completely silent and still. It wasn't scary at all. It was like I became outer space. And then for the next 7 hours, insight after insight after insight was injected into my heart. Not here, just the connection between all things was immediate. And then the connection between my mother and me. How had I forgotten this? How had I forgotten? She was my best friend. She loves me so much, always has. She's part of me. And I felt her love for me. I could feel her love for me. Then I saw my father. I as a young man, there's my dad, and it was like I became him, and I felt the pain at the loss of his own mom, and I squirmed in agony. I felt like a worm being poked with a stick. I felt it. How could I have been so naive to think that my dad couldn't love? Of course he did. He loved me as best he could, because he didn't say it, because he didn't express it the way I thought he should. We're doing the best we can. That's what we do. We do the best we can. This medicine, it was an internal love bath. It scrubbed me of all of my negativity, head to toe, didn't miss a spot. The most profound part of my experience on Ibogaine, I think, was when I learned how to love myself. And it happened like this. I saw this little boy, maybe 3 years old. He's standing facing a wall, had his head down, crying. He's completely ashamed of himself. And I'm kind of hovering over him. I know I need to help this little guy. But how does helping the little guy help the big guy? I didn't know what to do. And then this presence just surrounded us. And it put us into one. We were one and the same. And then it just exploded into this pure love energy. And from that moment, that was it. I love myself so much. In a good way. The real way. I didn't even know what love was. I had no idea. People talked about it. They sing about it. I didn't know. The next day, that Saturday, I'm walking around looking at the world I had never seen before. Looking at people's faces. Looking at my own face when I saw it in the mirror. Oh my gosh. I had never seen it before. I burst. My tears hit the glass. I was so happy. I was so content. I felt so loved. On Sunday, I took 5-MeO DMT. They told me to surrender. They said, just let go. And I'm like, let go? I think I already let go of everything. I had no idea what I was in for. I inhaled this toad venom. I held it in for about 10 seconds. And when I blew it out, I'm presented with a choice. Hang on or let go. There it is. Letting go meant death. No one told me that. I'm like, oh God, okay. But I was in such a trusting, such a loving place from the Ibogaine. I had no problem letting go. And when I did, the most intense light, and beyond it, infinity, nothing, no time, no space, infinite bliss, no sensations, no thoughts, And then to come back into this thing, this sensational thinking, breathing thing, I'm like, oh yes, this is what I get to be? Oh, hell yeah, this is it. This is where I get to do it. I'm this thing, and this is where I am. Oh, I'll take it. I'll take every bit of it. What a wonderful experience. And I know I'm preaching to the choir. Many of you know exactly what I'm talking about. And you know, these mystical experiences, that's not what it's all about. It's what you bring back. And what I brought back, a better version of myself. A much better version, a better husband, father, friend, a better human being, ready, willing, and able to serve, to help other people, to serve my planet, to serve this amazing world that I get to be a part of. What used to be anger is now love. What was judgment has become acceptance and sympathy. Where there was hypervigilance, loving awareness of everything, including this thing. It's amazing. Gosh, judgment, it's so awful, and it's gone. And now I'm so curious. I'm so full of amazement. Wow. My heart is so full of gratitude. So full of gratitude. And speaking of gratitude, there's people I need to thank. First, I'd like to thank you all for your contributions to this, to what you're doing, whatever it is. Thank you. To the Mission Within. The Mission Within, it's a treatment center that facilitated this healing. What a perfect name. Fucking mission success. Nonprofit organizations like VETS, that's Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions, they raise money for people like me to get these alternative treatments. Thank you. To my dear friend Jonathan Wilson, this man works relentlessly through his nonprofit, the Seal Future Foundation. It's what he does. He helps his brothers become whole, and he is so, so good at what he does. If you're wondering how to support any of this, I just ask that you donate to one of these foundations. Thank you all so much for listening to my story and for being a part of my story. That's all.
Okay. Yeah, let me wipe the tears away. So just a few more things, and then maybe we can open up to questions. And I think there's a few other folks I wanted to spend. Okay, great. So obviously, you can hear what we're doing, the effects that we're collectively having. We're fascinated with the data. Similarly, we're doing the best that we can with the tools that we have. So it is a wearable tech. But we do monitor HRV, your sleep habits, and what we found through partnerships with the Psychedelic Institute at Imperial College, and then we're also looking for other partners, colleges, to do some of these exploring, is that this is just more than turning into this. We're healing. Me personally, my HRV went from people thought I was dying, literally dying,
to tripling, and that's my new baseline. My sleep went from no REM, no deep, 30, 40 disturbances a night to I get maybe 2 or 3 disturbances, and I get 3 hours of REM. It's amazing. So we're trying to capture the data as best as we can. We're not doctors, but we're looking to partner, and we have partnered in the past. I think, once again, we are going to solve this, and it's not just going to be any one of us. So thank you for your time today. I think maybe we'll open it up for a few questions, and then I'll turn it back over to Anne, who's going to make a few more introductions. Yes?
So, thank you guys for coming. This is awesome. Do you have anybody like in VA medical centers who knows that you guys are doing this work or has taken any interest in it? Is there any kind of collaboration?
Yeah, so maybe I'll take a stab, and then if you want to weigh in.
Yeah, go ahead. The answer is no. No, not at all. And when I brought it up, they say no. Yeah.
Yeah, so directly, absolutely not. Collectively, so partner with MAPS through vets, other Navy SEALs, so vets is a couple of Navy SEALs as well. So I think, once again, maybe 1 or 2 degrees away, but not a direct relationship.
Thank you for your stories. Eric, I'm curious to know what the experience was like reintegrating into your family and what it was like for them to see you come home a completely different person.
Such a good question.
What were the challenges that you had?
Luckily for me, I have such a wonderful wife, and she was so accepting of what I brought home. I dropped a love bomb in my house, and she was like, oh, yes. It's only gotten so much better. I mean, I was just really a shell of what I could have been, what I am. I was hiding. I'd been hiding for so long. And when I came home, I'm like, baby, it's all about love. And it was well received. But I will add this, the integration for myself, it takes work. It's not, if I had left Mexico and went to some negative lifestyle or went back to negative patterns of life, I didn't allow myself to. I cut them out. It was a catalyst. The medicine was a catalyst for change. And I took it and I ran with it. I didn't want to go back. I'm like, this is wonderful. So I meditate every day. It's become such an important part of my life. And my diet changed. What I watch or don't watch on TV or listen to, everything is different. So my integration is still ongoing. This only happened 6 months ago. But I'm in a wonderful place. And it will continue, and I'll continue to help other people integrate after their medicine, because now I realize what is needed. You can't just go from that back to the way that you lived before. It has to be an immersion into a very positive and loving lifestyle, or else you could potentially lose what you got.
So the treatment center that you went to in Mexico, it seems like you have a very specific protocol for treatment.
Mm-hmm.
How did they develop it, and did they apply it to specifically the symptoms that you presented, or basically anyone who wants to have the treatment, they give it to them? How does that work?
Well, good question.
Yeah.
Do you know? I don't know.
And then I'll come back to I'll just add in on how we've evolved in regards to your question. So to answer yours is, and I don't want to, it'd probably make sense to go direct with them, but from what we've seen, because this is a question of ours, who qualifies for this treatment? So they do have a protocol. There is coaching that leads up to the treatment, during the treatment. It is in somewhat of a clinical setting, so there are doctors, there are nurses, and then there's also our brothers, essentially, there to support and to hold space. There's post-integration, and I think that's kind of where you were at, is the first evolution of this, in my opinion, we fell short, because not everybody is well received with love bombs at home, case in point. But how do we coach both the spouse and the recipient. And then where we're at today is, once again, there's coaching on the back end. Here's some ways to think about it. But we've also realized we're not the only one going through transition. It's our spouses, it's our brides, it's our girlfriends, and oh, by the way, they've had just as much trauma as we have. And a lot of that's been created by us, deploying, coming back, not knowing how to communicate. So, as mentioned earlier, my wife just went through the first women's retreat in Costa Rica. I feel so blessed, and she came back and dropped a love bomb. Eric was at my house, dropped a love bomb in our house.
It was amazing. Amazing.
Well received. I hope that answers the question. And if we want to talk more, maybe afterwards, I'd obviously make time. Yes? Yeah. Oh, this is such a, I struggle with this one. So I think they've noticed it, and just realizing we can't be this full version. We have to have some, and I hate to say it, some type of armor. We have to play the game to some degree, which I don't like to, but the reality is society, the world, the rules force us to. So there has to be this balance, and I think holding each other accountable, talking to each other about this, running ideas past each other before we do anything with our children. Because when I first came out of this, I thought the world should have it. And I somewhat still do, but I think there's times when they get it, and there are certain people that just maybe don't need it. So, Eric, what do you think about that question?
I can only speak for my personal account and my family. My children are young. They're 8, 6, and 2, 3 boys. And I think I was doing a pretty good job before. I was teaching them values that were, centered around integrity. But I didn't talk much about love. And that's how it's changed. I mean, now it's a loving household. I mean, that is like value number 1, love, compassion, sympathy, empathy, all these, like, where were those? Now they're at the front.
That's my question, is how did they deal with it? Because that's probably a big change for them.
Yeah, the kids adapt super quick. It was like, by the afternoon, they're like, now they remind me when, it's time to meditate. And I'll walk, I mean, I am seeing such an effect from what happened to me. It ripples outward. I mean, my in-laws, I have people over and I'll see my wife talking to her father, and like the eye contact that my wife has learned how to love through me, like really love and forgive and let go of things. And so I'll be like, oh, there it is. There it is. And I'll move into another room and I'll see one of my kids like meditating or breathing, like talking to his cousin about, something. And I'm like, there it is. My own dad, I mean, he is like, he's changed. I immediately went to him, I hugged him, told him I loved him, looked him right in the eyes, told him how much I love him. And then now I'm watching like him change and his relationship with my mom. And it's like, look at this. It's all changing. Does that answer your question?
Thank you very much for sharing your story. Can you describe what sort of support you're getting on an ongoing basis to stay in touch with other people who have had the experience or can generally support?
Great question. I have taken it upon myself. That's kind of to stay connected with friends and lean on we lean on each other. And friendships are now developing that I ran from before, and now I lean into them. I'm not afraid to tell Johnny that I love him and tell other friends how I feel about them. And when you start doing that, and people like that, and they like to share, and it gets them to come out, and it's like, oh, here they come. And now, like, I'm surrounded with support, completely surrounded. And so that's my experience. Now, everybody else has their own, and some people, the integration is not set, it's not properly set up. Some people go back to being alone. And I've been back to Mexico, to treatment centers several times to support and just be there. And when I can do that, I do that. And then I stay in connection with them. We get text threads going. And if somebody's fallen, like we're there to kind of help them up. But these guys are from all over the country, and it's hard.
Yeah. We've added, I'll just add on to that, and then we'll go to the next question. So we've changed the narrative. When before we were ashamed to talk about these things, we hid our secrets, if you will. We had our armor on. So our nonprofit just evolved and thought, maybe since everybody is shotgunned, why don't we try this bi-weekly call? And we share stories like Eric. So he comes on and shares, and the people that are transitioning, maybe haven't received treatment or don't even need treatment, but just want to share some of the suffering they're going through, now have a platform to do it. So that's version 1.0, and I guarantee it's going to keep evolving as we go. So we're learning as we go. Yes?
So a question, as you've seen the sort of deep healing that's going on, has it shifted the focus of your nonprofit from intellect-based scholarships and things like that that are very important to completely remaking human beings who, for a variety of reasons, are in need of?
Yeah, it's a great question. I resigned from my nonprofit last week, which I started, and it's purposeful because I want to focus on this. I want to partner with folks like you. And it's time. I think we can't shift away from the rules of the game. They need to go be educated. They need to do this properly. We can't go rogue. We have to do this and lean on people that have the credentials. So it's 8 years in the making, and we've helped over 700 people, and I am so grateful to turn over to a team that I trust. But to answer your question, the nonprofit's going to continue mission, and this is one sleeve of it that we partner with. And then for me personally, I'm in an evolution where I'm going to explore how to change the world, how to help people. Yeah. Okay.
So, dude, thank you as another male. Like it's hard to speak about society outside of this bubble here or this container here to talk about feelings and what that means to us. As a Latino male and somebody that is also white-facing, how are you advocating? You said like wives and spouses and stuff like that, but people who are SEALs or otherwise involved in the military and vets that don't share your same intersectionality as a white-facing male, being like it's a privilege to be able to share your story in front of all of us because of like some things that may be outward-facing in society on you and allowing you that space to have that kind of time and container to say those things that you did up here in front of all of us. So what kind of advocacy would you say or peace of mind would you give to people who have a different intersectionality, who may have a different sexual orientation, who may be a person of color, who also has these experiences, but is not, as you say, going back to an environment that's conducive and inviting and excited and allowing them to have a love bomb in their house, or whether that's in their community too, because as we see from the research, things aren't so diverse. So,
yeah. Can I take a stab at this?
Yeah, absolutely, man.
The most diverse team I've ever been a part of was the SEAL teams. You had folks that had all ethnic backgrounds. You had people that were given the option to serve in jail, multiple degrees, doctors, astronauts, professional football. So that's one way. I'm Latino too, despite my name being Wilson. I think the common thread here is love. I don't see what I used to see here, the different colors. I don't see that anymore. I see love and empathy. I see us all connected regardless of our skin color. With that being said, I respect your question and understand we need to provide this to others that don't have the ability to receive it. And I think that's where I'm at personally is I love this community. I would have given my soul, my life for it, and I have friends that did. And I'm super grateful what we've created and what's going to continue down this path, but this is bigger than the SEAL teams. This is bigger than any color, any ethnicity, and that's kind of the version that where I'm at today, and maybe you and I could talk afterwards to start something here, because I agree.
Thanks so much for a wonderful presentation, both of you. Quick question. Do you know what's the legality of ibogaine and 5-MeO-DMT in Mexico, and how do you as a U.S. organization navigate the waters of referring people to a treatment that is currently not legal here in the States?
Yep, it's a great question. So there's a benevolent that receives, all they do is receive donations. And then there's another entity that actually provides the treatment. They're completely separate entities in different countries. So that's how we're initially doing it, keeping it clean with trying to do everything above books. A lot of lawyers weighing in and helping us create these different entities. Initially, I'll be transparent, it was just one thing, and that's not the right model, and people could have gotten in trouble and hurt. So for us, they've recommended we separate it, and there's multiple entities in play. Is that it?
And in Mexico, is ibogaine or ibogaine and 5-MeO-DMT legal substances?
Yes.
Chris had a question.
Yeah. Chris.
Is that Chris?
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
Amazing
I was
eyes.
just curious, Eric, if you could, if your training as a SEAL supported or supports you in terms of integration and all these beautiful effects on your life. I'm just struck by your diligence and clarity of purpose and so forth, and I'm thinking, wow, that's exceptional in its own right. You know, I'm just wondering whether, yeah, some of that training you got as a SEAL actually helped you post-experience.
Yeah, I think it has. I think that my whole life experience has helped. It's like I was on one end of the spectrum and then I got catapulted to the other side. And I think just that shift alone, regardless of any, you know, the pain, like I was saying, the pain was just like an entire lifetime. And what I do think that SEAL training helped me with was when I took the ibogaine, and when a lot of people take that medicine, it's really, you know, arduous. It's like painful and physical. You know, people can't handle their bodies feeling the way that it does. And I think that my ability to just kind of, I don't know, my toughness, I guess I'd say, my ability to suffer. I mean, I'm very good at suffering. I've been doing it for a long time. And so that ability, I think, helped me a lot with just laying there and allowing the work to be done.
Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you.
Not quite done. We have many more important people to introduce you to. So if Bob Kaufman and Mark Bates could come up, they have a research proposal to study this treatment and can tell us a little bit about it. So Mark is they're both coming from the DC area. Mark is a recent graduate of CIS and Bob's about to start. He's a psychiatrist who was in the Navy for a long time.
Thank you.
And these experiences are so powerful, and we want to get the word out as much as we can, so we're really grateful to you for looking into doing a research project that we'd like to share. So please, can you share?
Well, thank you, Ron and Dick, for having us. And in some ways, I'd like to say everything that needs to be said has been said. And thank you both for standing up and telling your stories. You know, this is what motivates me to be here. My background a little bit more is I'm a retired Air Force pilot and psychologist. After I got out of uniform, I went to the DoD Center of Excellence for Psychological Health. And during that time, I started to learn about what psychedelics could do for people in terms of healing. And we practiced the highest rigor of evidence-based medicine for DoD, worked very closely with VA. And what I saw being offered by psychedelic therapies, in many cases, significantly surpassed what we were able to do. And it's especially these stories of people that have gone to our best doctors. And the doctors are doing their best to give everything they can to help. But for many, it's not enough. And some of the numbers we need to think about is there are studies that indicate that up to 2/3 of patients do not respond to the frontline treatments we're using for PTSD. 2/3 of patients, up to 2/3. And then the suicide rate is depending on where you look at the numbers, but the VA's latest number is 17 veterans per day. 17 veterans per day. So being in DOD, and actually my office was involved in overseeing suicide prevention for DOD, I can tell you that DOD and VA have poured tremendous resources into suicide prevention for over 10 years. They've involved all levels of government and nonprofits. It's amazing. Of all the countries in the world and organizations in the world, I think DOD and VA have done amazing efforts at changing suicide prevention or improving suicide prevention, but the numbers haven't changed. So there's, part of the story here is there's a real need. I love our veterans, that they are resourceful, and when they can't find the answers in one place, they look at another. When I was in CIIS, our director told me, because she knew I was a veteran, you know, we get consults from veterans frequently about psychedelics. And I was fascinated because I viewed the atmosphere of the DOD environment as very conservative, and I thought it would take a long time to move the needle. But I said, so what do we know about these, the veterans and the experiences they're having? And she shared that we really don't know much. We don't have any numbers, like there's no surveys, right? So over time, we decided to create a survey study with veterans, an anonymous survey study, much like the ones we do in DOD, where they ask about using illicit drugs because they need to know. So they make it anonymous. And in that process, Bob and I, who are colleagues in the military and have found probably the most important mission we could find in this effort, teamed up with two other researchers, one Alan Davis from Ohio State, used to be at Johns Hopkins, and Katinka Hoyer, who's at Wisconsin Medical College, and have developed a survey to send out to veterans. We're planning on reaching at least 1,000 veterans, so it's a lot of veterans. Initially, I thought, that might not be realistic. How many veterans could there be? But every month, I meet more and more veterans, and I will not be surprised if we have much more than 1,000 veterans who have had these experiences. And the other thing is that these stories are amazing. I mean, I'm going to update. You should not only write about this, but I think you should do a TED Talk. It's so beautiful. And this is the medicine. Right? The medicine is experiencing, sharing these stories of deep transformation and love and what it does for yourself and the people around you. Now, we hope in this survey that we're doing will capture some of these benefits. It's framed as a harm reduction survey, but we're measuring both harms and positive outcomes. We're also looking at risk and protective factors for veterans. And the idea is that if veterans are taking these issues into their own hands, we want to give them evidence-based information about how to have the experiences with the least likelihood of harm and the most likelihood of benefit. We hope that the survey results will inform future research. We hope that the survey results will let DOD and VA know that this is not just a few veterans. There are a lot of veterans using these medicines. We expect the results to be very low harm and significant benefit. We're using the standardized measures that the DOD and VA use to measure what are the changes in outcomes. Yeah, I think those are the main things I'd want to share, but Bob, would you like to add anything else?
Good afternoon. Other than, once again, thanking Moose for, I've heard his story and have contributed to his healing for since the journey in October, and every time I hear it, I just get so moved, and I'm so grateful that there are people like him who are brave enough to share their stories. And interestingly, I don't know if Moose would as a postscript, but
when I talk with him, I ask him, you know, he's not had a bad day since the 3rd of October, until this came up. And then he started having all of this anxiety associated with speaking in front of a group of people. And as I've seen with others who have kind of gone through the journey, when they start feeling some anxiety, Ron's going to comfort Moose right there. He's actually trained to do that. When individuals start doubting whether the effects are real, then they start overthinking it, and oh my God, the anxiety's back, and maybe I'm not as well as I. Anyway, so Moose kind of went through that, and this is a perfect test that you are solid, Moose, and you make so much. You made so many people proud of your recovery. I've been getting texts from his wife, just hearts. Tell him I love him. Tell him I love him through his presentation. So anyway, as Mark said, this study that we're doing is incredibly important because there's so much variability in terms of underground sessioning out there. And I've seen, just in my few short experiences, I've seen a lot of harm come to individuals who didn't know what they were getting into, had no preparation, the set and setting were not controlled. So this harm reduction study is critically important for all of the settings that are going to, that sessioning is going to occur, to hopefully give them some guidelines. So, and.
I wish we had more time, and anyone who's interested in learning more about this, certainly, I think everyone's willing to hang around. And I think this study is so important just to let people know how many veterans are using these medicines and what a difference they're making. So thank you.